partly because we've gone over a lot of these things already. And partly because I kind of want to focus on fewer points because there are tons of them to make. And so I just want to kind of bring one very crucial point to your attention. Like a lot of things in this field, it's not one where I have a final answer for you, which is kind of crazy after 20 years of working in this field. So I guess it means we haven't progressed very much, or maybe we've progressed a lot to the point where we can see these points. But this is just kind of to bring to your mind a problem. If you are conscious of it, you may avoid mistakes and misinterpretations. And eventually, probably not too far into the future, we will have kind of algorithms in hand that respond directly to this concern. So essentially the concern is that we estimate what it is that we want to estimate, okay? And very frequently we use estimators that estimate things that don't resemble what we're really seeking. So I told you about fundamental ecological niches. Didn't tell you much about their characteristics, but given that that's usually the target of our modeling, we ought to use tools that reconstruct objects that resemble fundamental ecological niches. Does that make sense? Right? So let's talk with some physiologists, and I've done this over the years. Every time I bump into a good ecological physiologist, I say, can you point out to me an instance in which a tolerance curve has two modes, right? And the answer is always no, okay? Which is to say, if you look across the world of physiological ecology, if you look in terms of theoretical considerations, I'm not a physiologist, so don't hit me with deep questions about this, but if you look at, essentially the biochemical responses, there really aren't many situations under which you might expect an optimum at 10 degrees and another optimum at 20 degrees. And if you look at the empirical data with looking at response curves, these are all for temperature, but you always see some sort of intermediate optimum. If you do see an optimum at one end of the spectrum, that doesn't mean that looking at more extreme values, you wouldn't see an intermediate optimum. My point is that you don't see gaps, you don't see holes between optima. And so that basically means that with respect to any one dimension of the environment, our ecological niches are pretty simple, right? Some optimum, some slightly suboptimal conditions around it, and then non-optimal or non-usable conditions farther away. And what we don't see is multiple modes. If you translate that into multiple environmental dimensions, then you get a polyhedron that is in some sense simple, right? It's at least convex. It doesn't have folds. It doesn't have Swiss cheese holes in it. And so that gives us a very interesting set of qualities for this quantity that we're trying to estimate. Here is a look at response surfaces from some of the older niche modeling tools. We have these very old tools that were basically based on essentially range rules or a minimum convex polygon or polyhedron in environmental space around the known observations. We have some methods that are based on distances out from the known occurrences. Then we have other methods that essentially are contrasting presences and absences in different ways. And all I want you to see is that we can very easily get multiple optima in these responses. Now, we've already told you that we're going to be talking Maxent in this class, the only God in the pantheon. I'm being good, Mona, don't worry. Maxent very, very easily can give you multiple optima, multiple modes along the response to one particular environmental dimension. And so we've got a problem in that our estimators estimate objects that don't look anything like what we want to estimate. So why do we use these tools? I'm not criticizing just Maxent. I'm criticizing the whole toolkit. We've got a set of problems. One is that the object estimated can be more complex than we want. And the other is the consideration of the background, essentially the available environmental conditions. And I'll come back to that. But it's essentially a reason why we don't just go back and use bioclim and things like that that are very simple. So just some things to think about is that we expect unimodal response curves that translates into convex shapes in multiple dimensions. We do not expect and we do not wish to see folds, wrinkles, holes, gaps, or anything like that. And so we have this relatively simple response surface. We have our tools that give us kind of the wrong shapes. So let's take a look at that environmental background. So I took the liberty of looking at Tennessee. I threw on, I think it was 4,000 random points across the state. And I looked at temperature and precipitation. And I graphed those against each other. Remember I told you that these environmental spaces are really weird. Right? They have these arms and tentacles. Notice that there's a dense area here and a dense area here. They're wacky, okay? It's the topology of environments across a politically defined polygon, right? You have that piece of the Appalachians here in eastern Tennessee, and then you have, essentially going down towards the Mississippi River. Tennessee makes no sense environmentally. Right? That's not a political statement, I swear. So let's look at this environmental space and think about trying to estimate a convex two-dimensional niche. Okay? And I just want to remind you that our niches can have very different positions. That's one where it's falling in a set of conditions that's very well represented across this state. That's one that has a little bit of a problem, right? Just kind of over here. A little bit of it is unrepresented, where the existing niche would be less than the full fundamental. But then we can get some really weird stuff in here. Remember I told you no bimodal niches. Well, we can get bimodal existing niches easily, all the time. And then we can get things that are probably just beyond hope as far as getting a rigorous estimate. Okay? So now so that's just kind of making the point that when I talk about the existing niche being smaller than the fundamental, I mean it in real world terms. It happens all the time. So Now let's imagine we have some data. Okay? Those are occurrence points. Obviously, they're totally fabricated. So my examples will work perfectly, right? But I want you to think about what we're going to do with these data. And it doesn't matter what algorithm we use. Doesn't matter if it's Maxent. Doesn't matter what the algorithm is. This is going to be easy because we have presences that are nice and clumped together. And either we have absence data, or more likely we have pseudo-absence data that surround that small cloud very densely on all sides. Right? So with variation, but pretty much any algorithm you apply to that species, it's going to be easy. And it's going to find some shape that fits closely around those points. Right? So let's go over here. Now our occurrence points are out here, and they're kind of getting close to the edge. And so we can then look for sets of convex objects, that essentially fit our assumptions about niche response types that also fit well to these points. And what do we have to do? We have to be thinking very carefully about the negative evidence around this, but then the lack of negative evidence out here. So there should be a lot of penalty for a solution that comes out like this, but no penalty for one that goes out like that. Do you see that? And then, of course, we can get into a miserable part of the world, and you can see that we should have lots of uncertainty, right? In this case, our ellipsoid, the major axis, can flip by 90 degrees very easily. So my point in this is kind of giving you a vision towards a very interesting next generation of modeling algorithms that are focused on fundamental ecological niches. Jorge Soberon has been looking at this for quite a while. He's a professor at the University of Kansas, would call himself a theoretical ecologist. We call him an applied biodiversity scientist. Jorge has a student who's a mathematician. Her name is Laura Jimenez. And her dissertation is focused around this estimation question. So essentially, she's using Bayesian estimators to pick out families of solutions that work well with a data set, and then looks at the uncertainty manifested amongst those families. She's using multidimensional ellipsoids, and essentially she has it to the point where it fits well to the points, but she's struggling with this magnifying the uncertainty. I'm fairly optimistic that she'll solve these things pretty soon, because I think she's done kind of the time-consuming parts. But essentially, just to give you a view of this commentary, it's that we really, really are frequently fitting the wrong shape to the thing that we're trying to get out. And that's going to give us either wrong answers or misleading answers or confusing answers. So we have to be very cautious about fitting the right type of response. And don't think, oh, well, I can just cut Maxent down to linear and quadratic response types, because you will have forgotten that quadratic responses can be like that also, right? We want it to be like this, but it can be like this, and that means we have a nice bimodal response. And those are actually quite common. So we're wanting to estimate the fundamental niche, and for a huge number of reasons, but a lot of them revolving around this question of what does the realized or existing niche look like compared to the fundamental, we can often get a very different answer. We should be aiming for something that is convex, and to that end, for the moment, the user has to take pretty serious precautions. Hopefully, maybe by the next time we do one of these workshops, but maybe not, a solution will be in hand. It will be computationally expensive. It won't just sit and run on your laptop in 15 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 minutes or 1 minute. Okay? Anyhow, just a commentary about fundamental niches, response types, and what it is we're estimating using these algorithms.
So earlier this morning, we used invasive species as an example of not knowing where things can access. It's an unknown. But what about the converse of that when you're dealing with rare species? So you use Tennessee as an example. So I'm thinking of, say, egret sunflower that's only found in the physiographic province of the Highland Rim, which is unique in its certain soil types. It's unique for its topographic position, things like that. So how do you take that multiplicity of factors and not come up with some kind of odd way to assess how that rare species occurs in this rare set of conditions?
Sure. So one of the key things is, with respect to climate, a species like that, I'm imagining something that's very substrate driven. A species like that may effectively be a Wallace's dream species. It may essentially have all of its range limits set by access or even the existence of that substrate, and not by its tolerance limits to abiotic conditions that are varying gradually and smoothly over landscapes. And so, at least at coarse spatial resolutions, you may be talking about a Wallacean species. So what can you do about that? You can certainly improve the spatial resolution of the occurrence data and of the environmental data. They have to improve in tandem. So throw those climate data out the window. Get good GPS data for a species like that. So now we're talking about accuracy, let's be honest and call it 50 to 100 meters, not 10 meters. So you have your 50 to 100 meter accurate occurrence data. Go to a remotely sensed data source for environmental data. MODIS will take you down to 250 meters, and then some of the other sensors can get you down into the 30 to 50 meter realm. And now you have the possibility of picking out environmental dimensions that do end up excluding the species within its accessible area. Okay? But at that coarse range and using, the kind of canonical data sets of, WorldClim, many species, we should just walk away from them. And then another kind of dimension of the same answer is you can also walk away from the complex algorithms. And so one thing we've done with extremely rare species is just to use an environmental matching, an environmental similarity. And you don't even try to get a niche model. You just get a view of the landscape as very similar, less similar, less similar, not at all similar, right? Exactly. I mean, just like a Euclidean distance in environmental space or a Mahalanobis distance. And that becomes very interesting because it can allow you to find more populations.
So the theory, the univariate response curves should be unimodal, right? But then in the bivariate example that you showed, these oddities can appear because there's interaction between the variables, no?
if you intersect any two unimodal response curves, you get a convex polygon. Okay? You only get concave or complex polygons if your univariate responses are also complex. I mean, play with it. If you just you will get a convex polygon if you've got convex single responses.
So adding interactions is not helpful.
Well, so like the old bioclim models were simple range rules. 20 to 50 on this axis and 10 to 20 on this axis, and you got a box or a cube or But what the interactions between the variables will do is throw away the corners of those boxes. But it won't create exactly. Okay, it won't create holes and folds and things like that.
No sound.
There we go.
Thanks. So in my view, my understanding of the physiological models, for example, the fitness with respect to temperature, the kind of curves you showed, can predict or kind of mechanistically extrapolate the areas where the species cannot survive, for example, the shoulders. So, but the niche models can't. And my question is, like I read a paper 6 years ago written by you, and you're suggesting probably we could use these mechanistic, incorporate mechanistic models into the niche modeling. And my question is like, is it happen? I haven't read since then, but like I was wondering whether.
That's a really good question. In the book that a bunch of colleagues and I published in 2011, we were kind of bending over backwards to be respectful to mechanistic models, and basically said, well, the correlational models are not going to give you a clean and clear view of the fundamental ecological niche, but a mechanistic model could, if you could develop it, and it's complex to develop. That was kind of the dictum that we had in the book in 2011. Then I think the paper that you read is something that Jorge Soberon and Mona and I wrote. And there we were trying to give kind of a more balanced view. And it was an interesting thing that we did because writing that review forced us to look carefully at the mechanistic model papers. One complication with them is that they tend to look at one dimension or two dimensions of the environment, right? They tend to be, such and such species responds to moisture stress, or such and such species responds to temperature. And certainly a lesson from the correlational models is that a bunch of dimensions usually are important. But I think the most scary thing that came out of that was from Mona, because she took one of the very dominant mechanistic modeling frameworks, got it running, which was not easy, and started plugging in parameter estimates. And you look at their papers, and they always give you a table of, the insulative properties of the skin, or the rate of conversion of ingested calories to chemical energy. All these things that you need to build that first principles model. And the interesting thing was that the precision in those parameter estimates was really low. Sometimes it was like 10%. And that's not a measured property. Even if it were a measured property, it's measured for one population and maybe not characteristic of all the populations, or maybe not characteristic of the variance amongst individuals in all the populations. So we started playing with a very simple sensitivity analysis. Take a parameter, and change its value by, what did we do, 10% or 1%? X percent up and down. And the resulting fitness surfaces were diametrically different. Which is to say, we started looking at the mechanistic models for a sensitivity analysis, because my understanding of when you build a mathematical model is you basically look at your parameters and figure out to which ones is it most sensitive. And we really couldn't find an example of that being done carefully. And so we realized, oh shit, this is so sensitive to those parameter estimates. And sometimes those parameter estimates were, well, for the species we're looking at, we don't really have that estimate, so we looked at a congener. Uh-oh. So I think my adoration of the mechanistic modeling god has muted a little bit. I love the idea, and I would love to be able to sit down and kind of meld the two worlds. And actually with Mayoa and his advisor, we're talking about doing exactly that with malaria transmission models, where you have these beautiful models of the life cycle of a parasite and its vectors. And we have the environmental context and how it varies across an important region. So, yeah, not a happy world.